Ladies and gentlemen, well, I want to thank you all first for coming along and gathering here for the philosophy panel of the Oxford Forum. And I know that it really needs commitment and enthusiasm to come here in these extreme weather conditions. My name is Yutang, and I am a DPhil candidate in political theory here in Oxford. I'm speaking here now in my capacity as director and moderator of the philosophy panel. It is indeed my great honor and a privilege to put on and participate in what is going to be a terrific panel discussion. You all, our distinguished panel speakers. I will introduce short rather than long because I know that you want to hear them rather than me. Well, so Dr. Nicholas Bunnin is a distinguished philosopher in Confucian philosophy in the UK. And he is one of the most respected and decorated here in Oxford. I'm not praising him not only as his student, but on behalf of all Oxonians who know and respect him. He is currently Director Emeritus of the Chinese Philosophy Project at the China Center, and he's honorary professor in Shandong University in China and also in the Chinese Academy of Social Science. He has written extensively on philosophy. With Yi Cui James, he edited the Blackwell Companion to Philosophy, and with Ji Yuanyu, he edited the Dictionary of Western Philosophy, Chinese and English. These books have become guidebooks for all scholars and students specializing or interested in philosophy. Also, Professor Tongdong he is a very well-known Confucian scholar in China. He is Dongfang Chair Professor of Philosophy at Fudan University in China and a Global Professor of Law at New York University School of Law. His expertise is in Chinese philosophy and Western political philosophy. His book, China, The Political Philosophy of the Middle Kingdom, was published by Z Books in 2012. And he has recently finished a manuscript in English, tentatively titled In Defense of Inequality, Confucian Alternatives to Liberal Democratic Order, which is now under review for publication. Professor Bai is actively involved in other academic and social activities aimed at promoting new political norms that draw wisdom from both traditional Chinese philosophy and Western analytical philosophy. And Dr. Ting is a senior lecturer at the University of Sheffield School of Law. She was a lecturer at the School of Law, Queen's University, Belfast, and a research fellow at the London School of Economics. Her research interests include property rights, Chinese legal studies, and law and governance in China. She is the author and the editor of two books, The Revival of Private Property and Its Limits in Post-Mao China, and Property and Human Rights in a Global Context. In 2015, Dr. Xu completed a project on declining diversity and declining societies, China, the West, and the future of the global economy, funded by the European Commission. The theme of the philosophy panel is a Confucian China for the future. In exploring this topic, our speakers will be talking about Confucianism in general and Confucian implications for Chinese society, politics, and law. And I'm aware that some of you may expect me to particularly enunciate the word politics. I know the reason why, as well as much of you do. So, but I think you should have kind of reasonable expectations from the philosophy panel, and our distinguished speakers will contribute to this debate based on their own expertise, and I expect it to be a interesting, very engaging discussion. Well, now so without further ado, I will turn things over to Dr. Xu first. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really, I'm pleased to see everyone here. It wasn't an easy journey from Sheffield to Oxford, so I'm glad I made the journey. So today I'm going to talk about the Confucian ethos, responsibility, and climate change. To address this panel's theme, which is a Confucian China for the future. So for Confucian ethos, I'm not going to give a comprehensive overview of Confucianism, but I'm going to focus on the discussion on the family, the state, and heaven, so 家国天下. And one of the most important aspects of Confucian teaching, which is the cultivation of a virtuous, responsible, and caring person. This is well expressed in the Great Learning, and here I quote, "Only when personal lives are cultivated are families regulated. Only when families are regulated are states governed. Only when states are governed is there peace all under heaven. Therefore, from the Son of Heaven to the common people, all, without exception, must take self-cultivation as the root." So the Confucian elites emphasized 修齐治平, namely self-cultivation, family management, state governance, and the maintenance of the social order. These four aspects are not separate. Rather, they constitute important parts in the continual developmental process. Confucians take a holistic view of the world, and they don't draw a clear distinction between self and others. They view heaven, earth, and self as a whole. For Confucians, responsibility is vested in the individual, the family, and state for maintaining peace and social order under heaven. Now, let's think about responsibility and climate change. So who is responsible for climate change? And we know that humanity is transferring fossil carbon to the atmosphere at an almost unprecedented rate. But it is difficult to attribute responsibility for climate change. This is why the commitment to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact is one of the Sustainable Development Goals set in 2015 in the context of the UN General Assembly 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Climate change is a global issue. For example, greenhouse gas emissions occurred in the United States, or even in an individual's use of a diesel car would have a huge global impact. Some scholars argue that climate change is the largest and most complex collective action problem. It is largest because everyone is a climate change actor and everyone is being affected by climate change. It is also complex because if we look at this climate system, it embodies this high degree of connectivity. So individual people, nations, international organizations, and corporations are all climate change actors, and they're also being affected by climate change. These actors are closely connected, interacting in a non-linear way. Tackling climate change, therefore, requires a holistic approach to attributing responsibility for climate change. So responsibility is vested in individuals, nations, international organizations, and corporations, although they have different capacities in tackling climate change. So let's think again about the implications of the Confucian ethos. And I think it is useful for reframing responsibility for climate change. Again, an understanding of the relationship between the family, the state, and heaven is important. Mencius once said, people have this common saying, heaven, the state, and the family. The root of heaven is the state, and the root of the state is the family, and the root of family is the self. So the self, the family, and heaven, or the whole social order, are closely linked to each other. The self is embedded in the family is embedded in the state, and the state is embedded in heaven. This kind of social structure in China, and to borrow Fei Xiaotong's metaphor, is similar to concentric circles formed when a stone is thrown into a lake. So the self is like the stone, and the family, the state, and heaven, they all like these concentric circles formed around the idea of the self. And this social structure is not without limits. Chinese philosopher Liang Shuming once divided society into 4 parts: individuals, families, associations, and heaven. And unlike Western culture, which emphasizes individuals and associations, Chinese culture prioritizes families and heaven. Fei Xiaotong also argued that Chinese society lacked social organizations that can transcend personal relations. So there lacked associations that exist between families and the state. That said, the Confucian ethos is still quite useful for reframing responsibility in climate change. So if we think about the idea of the unity of heaven and humanity, it implies 3 inseparable dimensions of the human condition, namely self, community, and nature. The self, as the center of relationships, establishes identity by interacting with community, broadly understood from the family, the state, and the global village, and beyond. So there's a harmonious integration of self, community, and heaven. And if we follow this holistic view, we could argue that individuals, nations, international organizations, and corporations, they should all be held responsible for climate change and for a shared future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Xu, and let's turn to Professor Bai. Yes.
Okay, first thanks to Yutang and Nick and the organizers for getting me involved. And also thank you all for coming during this snowstorm. It's called The Beast from the East, which is a nice setting for China Forum, also from the East. And I have a written speech, so I'm going to just read that. And so the title of my speech is called Confucianism to Save the World. And I gave this kind of speech before, and a friend of mine asked me whether I forget a question mark in the end. I said, no, it's a statement, it's not a question. Confucianism to save the world. Okay, so since the collapse of the Soviet Union, it has been widely believed that the history has already ended with liberal democracy and a liberal democratic order. But domestically, newly democratized countries are often plagued with ethnic violence. And developed liberal democracies are also faced with problems such as the recent financial crisis, the growing inequality, and as a result, the rise of populism from both the left and from the right. Internationally, military-based humanitarian interventions seem to create more miseries than they are intended to solve. And the failures to meet the intervention's moral demands breed skepticism and cynicism. The less aggressive form of globalization, such as the EU and the global market, doesn't do well either. It is perhaps time to explore new political models with an open mind. In the following, I will argue that Confucianism may offer some promising alternatives. Here, I understand Confucianism to be a political philosophy that's meant to be universal. I think in the morning session, Dr. Meter said that Confucianism is a local culture, but I think Confucianism at the beginning, the early Confucians understand their teaching as universal, as applicable to everyone. Just as Platonism is now something that's meant to be applicable only to the Athenians. So to understand the Confucian alternatives, let me go back to the early Confucians. They lived in a time of a great transformation from 770 BCE to 221 BCE. Through the transition, a few de facto sovereign states emerged in the newly globalized world, the world known to the Chinese. Every state was large, populous, well-connected, and plebeianized, and its people were strangers to each other. This transition may be a forerunner of the European transition to modernity, and even of the globalization in our times. Common to all these transitions is the need to answer three key political issues in this new world. First, the bond of a large state of strangers. Second, the principles of international relations among independent states. And third, the selection of ruling members of the state, even the world, and the legitimacy of such a selection. These questions were also faced by early modern European thinkers. In a sense, our contemporary world is but an enlarged version of the Chinese world with which early Confucians faced. But different from the ones offered by the Europeans, Confucians offered their own answers. To address the issue of a new social bond, Mencius, an important Confucian thinker, argued for the universality of the sentiment of compassion, a sense of care towards strangers. A famous thought experiment he offered to show this universality of compassion is this. He said, if you suddenly see a baby who is about to fall into a well, that is, to be killed, would you feel a sense of alarm and distress? If you think about it, it's a really beautifully designed thought experiment for many reasons. It uses a baby that embodies innocence, rather than an adult who might have done something to deserve to be killed. It asks our immediate rather than calculated response. And it asks us how we feel, not what we will do. So it's hard to answer no to such a well-designed question. So I think through this experiment, he tries to show that everyone has this seed of care toward a mere stranger. But he also knows that this sentiment, though universal, is also very fragile. In order for it to be strong enough to hold strangers together, it needs to be cultivated. And family is the first and most important institution in which this cultivation can take place. This is why familial care is so important to Confucians. So Confucianism is no philosophy Don Corleone, the Godfather, namely never go against your family, as some people have argued, criticized. Rather, family is the institution where we learn to care about others by first learning to care about family members. From family members to neighbors, from neighbors to community members, and so on, like ripples caused by throwing a pebble into a pond, metaphor Fei Xiaotong used and Dr. Xu just mentioned, which can be spread to cover the whole surface of the pond. The expanding concentric circles of care can eventually embrace every human being, past, present, and future, and even animals, plants, and things in the world. Therefore, family is the key to the Confucian path to transcendence. And in this transcendence, the world of strangers is united. It should also be emphasized, however, that even at this stage of universal care, Confucians think that one still does and should care about the closer ones more than the more distant ones. So, in a word, the Confucian moral ideal is universal but unequal care. Therefore, by compassion, the whole world can be bounded together, but at the same time, one is justified to care about one's own state more than other states. Besides, early Confucians also suggested that the identity of a state be based on culture that is particular to each individual state, but not on nation in the sense of race. Culture as an identity is different from nation or race in that the former is inclusive, while the latter is not. Through the cultural identity and the hierarchical care, patriotism is thus justified by Confucians. But while caring about one's own state first, one should not disregard the interests of other peoples completely, because we as human beings also care about other peoples if we deserve the title of a human. That is, patriotism is also curtailed by Confucians. Moreover, all the states with compassion should form an alliance that protect the civilizedness of these states, and they should play the role of world police. They should never fight war against each other because they are civilized, and by definition, a fight against another state for material gains is an act of beasts, not humans. That is, for Confucian, there's a civilized peace, not democratic peace. But if the people of another state suffers greatly from a bad regime, the alliance of civilized states should intervene, even with military forces, although the latter have to be used cautiously. Indeed, Mencius argued that only when the suffering is so bad that the people are ready to welcome the invaders can the liberation be carried out and justified. In short, the Confucian world order, or the Tianxia order, is a compassion-based hierarchy. The principle beneath this world order is that for Confucians, humanis, 人, humanity, benevolence, not human rights, overrides sovereignty. But unlike cosmopolitanism, a radical version of liberalism, according to which everyone should be treated equally with equal care, and states should eventually be abolished, Confucians consider the existence of states legitimate. And the Confucian model puts the state's interest above other states. But different from the nation-state model, this priority is not absolute. And the sovereignty of a state is limited by how humanely the state treats its people. If we understand the idea of nation-state is introduced in the Western modernity in order to answer the question of bonding a large state of strangers together, a question early Confucians also faced. And the cosmopolitan model is an attempt to correct the excesses of the nation-state model. Then we should compare all three models together and see which one is the best. From a Confucian perspective, the nation-state model is too demeaning to human beings because it treats human beings as self-interest-driven animals only. And the cosmopolitan model is too demanding to human beings because it treats human beings as selfless angels. Thus, the Confucian Tianxia model is more realistic than the cosmopolitan model and is more idealistic than the nation-state model. It is borrowing a term from the late John Rawls, American political philosopher. So the Confucian Tianxia model is a realistic utopia that strikes a golden mean between the two extremes. Just give one example. On the immigration issue, Confucians would reject the cosmopolitan proposal of opening the door to immigrants on the basis that the freedom movement is a human right. And they would also reject the nationalist proposal of closing the door completely to the immigrants. Rather, immigrants, from the Confucian perspective, should be accepted under the condition that the well-being of the people of the whole state is not affected greatly, and the cultural identity of the state can be preserved. So that's about the state identity and international relations. And then in terms of local governance, domestic governance, Confucians also believe that the state is for the people and of the people, and should be held accountable for the service to the people. It should be the people who decide on whether they are satisfied with the service or not. But a crucial difference between Confucians and Democrats is that the former do not think that the state should be by the people. We know Lincoln had this famous saying, democracy is of the people, for the people, and by the people. I think the Confucians can agree with the first two elements, but not the last one, by the people part. Like the Democrats, Confucians believe that all human beings have equal potential to govern themselves and are the best judge of whether they're happy with their life or not. But unlike the Democrats, Confucians also believe that in reality, only the few have the moral and intellectual capacities to govern, and the masses are now morally and intellectually competent to make political decisions, even for their own benefit. Thus, Confucians would endorse a hybrid regime that combines democratic elements through which the people's will is expressed with meritocratic elements, with people with merits, through which some political decisions are made. For example, a bicameral legislature with a democratically elected lower house and a meritocratically selected upper house. It's to be noted that this regime should be firmly built on constitutionalism that protects rights and liberties. Constitutionalism, maybe not democracy, is perhaps the real contribution the West has made to humans' search for an ideal regime, and Confucianism can embrace it. Now, the next issue, why this Confucian ideal regime a good regime? To see this, we have to realize that the present democratic institution, especially that of one person, one vote, has 4 problems. It encouraged, first, it encouraged radical individualism and anti-intellectualism. An example I like to mention before was Sarah Palin was considered a serious political candidate, but now have President Trump, which is a much better example of that. And the second, it gives all political authority to the present voters. But in a globalized world, the policies of one state, such as environment policies, on deficit, has effects on non-voters, such as foreigners and future generations. I think climate change is one such example. But climate change affects everyone, but the policy of a state that will have implication to climate change is decided by the voters of that state only. And I think that's a structural challenge to issues like climate change. Third, it often overly or tacitly encourages the majority to silence the minorities. In a recent democratized state without the rule of law and the protection of rights, it's often expressed through ethnic cleansing and genocide. In a liberal democratic state, now have the election of anti-immigrant president in the US, which gives hope to Marine Le Pen and many other Trumpsters in this world. And lastly, the one person, one vote builds on an unrealistic premise that voters are rational about their own self-interest. It is unrealistic for 2 reasons. Almost all modern states are way too large for common people to understand state-level affairs. And the majority of people who are so busy with their own job don't even have time to understand them. In a word, the root cause of many problems plaguing democracies today is that there's too much equality and too much democracy, and the latter poses a threat to liberty. So perhaps it's time to realize that we have gone too far down the road of equality in our attempt to correct the excesses of the nobles, and we should now correct the excesses of the uninformed and immoral masses and save liberty from democracy through the Confucian hybrid regime. The last question, just to conclude my speech, the last question is, how do we get there even if the problem with liberal democracy are structural and the Confucian hybrid regime is indeed a better alternative? To be clear, the Confucian hybrid regime is ideal, and the present Chinese government or any government is nowhere close to it. Then for this ideal to become reality, more and more crises will have to plague democracies, and state is fed up, tries the Confucian regime, and prospers. Only then will people really listen. However, before this could happen, if it could ever happen, we may end up listening to one after another false prophet. After all, among theorists, the mainstream voice is still that the solution lies in more democracy and more equality. In reality, probably I shouldn't say this here, the Brits chose Brexit and Americans chose Trump, and a few more are on the way. So with this uplifting note, I end my speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bai, for this very interesting talk. Let's turn to Dr. Nicholas Bunnin.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me and the organizers for arranging this extremely impressive occasion. I have Confucian questions rather than Confucian statements, but I think that Professor Bai got on to questions at the end, which is a good way for me to continue. And what I want to do, first of all, is to ask about Confucius's own conception of what he was and what he was doing as we have received it. There's a lot of re-examination of early Chinese philosophy stimulated by the discovery of early Han Dynasty texts on bamboo and on silk, which gives new perspectives on the ideas that have become commonplace about what Confucius was doing, what the intellectual culture, what the social culture, what the legal culture was in his time, seen retrospectively from a few or more hundred years later in the Han Dynasty. So something is fluid in our understanding of Confucius. But there are things that, at least in the received version, we can raise as questions. Confucius didn't see himself as a political theorist or an ethical theorist. He saw himself as a transmitter and as a specialist. He was a transmitter of the ancient way of successful, harmonious, and happy society that had fallen apart for reasons that are open to discovery and discussion in his time and in ours. And that he was thinking that peace and harmony, both at the social level and at the personal level, were something that could be refounded and restored. He saw himself as a specialist in rites or in ritual, and he thought that he was restoring or recovering through the documentation of ancient times available in his time, a world that had been lost. And that by restoring at least some aspects of that world through ritual, that he would have a pathway to peace, prosperity, flourishing both of individuals and the state and other intermediate institutions such as the family or association perhaps. So that if we look at Confucius now, we have quite well-defined notions of theoretical work in philosophy, in political philosophy, in ethics, epistemology, international relations. We're framing him and his work in a way that he might have objected to. But nevertheless, his work made possible the very early flourishing of theorists as interpreters of Confucius. The other question is that everything I'm saying might be contentious, but that's nothing new in the Confucius and Confucian traditions in China. Because one of the earliest kind of complaints of one Confucius school or individual about contemporaries or predecessors is they got Confucius wrong. And let me give you an example about a view that Confucius had that the basic organization of society and also of individual life should be in terms of rites or ritual, not human rights, but the rights of, not religious, but practical rights of how to entrench a certain way of looking at order in society and in individual lives. And that this emphasis, an early Confucian, but not the earliest, a major commentator, Xinzi, said that Mengzi, who has been mentioned by both of the panelists already, got things wrong because he had no understanding of why rights might be important in thinking about society and thinking about individuals. He claimed that for Mengzi, we had our natural seeds or sprouts of the most important virtues that only need to be protected against destruction or distortion for them to flourish. And that they were internal to individuals, internal to human beings generally, although in many human beings, both in China and amongst barbarians abroad, they had been extinguished or distorted to monstrous form rather than appropriate civilizational form. Well, Xinzi thought that this wasn't an adequate account of why rites and ritual propriety would be at all important in terms of self-cultivation and the cultivation of a way of living together in society. He argued that instead of individuals having these inherent natural tendencies or powers, that we were disorganized and conflicting, weren't able to achieve harmony in ourselves or in social life because we were dominated by emotions and desires that couldn't be fulfilled, or once fulfilled would spring back again. They were infinite, and they also weren't all coherent. So even if we followed certain desires and lunged after them to be fulfilled, we could never be successful in having a comprehensive view of the desires we have as human beings. And he thought that this meant that we had to be educated, not simply to preserve what was in us, but to inculcate what was in us through ritual and through an education in ritual that would cover not only our individual self-transformation, which would move from being a common people whose actions and perceptions of life and oneself and others was dominated by desire and self-interest for wealth, for power, for sexual gratification, other sensory gratifications, which wasn't a recipe for harmony, but rather we would have to transform these desires, not to eliminate them, but to have them have a proper engagement with ourselves as heart minds, as people with emotion and desire and also reason, not as dichotomized, as different from one another as they are in Plato's account of a tripartite soul, but in the heart mind having interlocking reciprocal relationships that would be dominant. And that, so he didn't deny reason, but he saw reason having a particular place within ourselves and within society. And this is very, very important. But the question is now, if we take his view that in organizing society, that culture that is infused with ritual would be a preferable means of organizing society over law, where you might say that in ritual, what goes wrong, it leads to emotions of shame, whereas law leads to emotions of guilt. How we can understand society being organized basically in terms of ritual and criticism of the inappropriate use or denial of ritual rather than illegality. But it's also very interesting that very early on, there were other ways of thinking about society and the self, and also relationship to nature, to the Tao of nature, that were competitors with Confucius's ideas and the early Confucians. And because there wasn't a tradition of heresy within Confucianism or within society at large in China, where you would have a dominant view that couldn't be questioned without being banished and outlawed and punished, you have interplay of ideas, principally between Confucianism and Taoism, which is very, very critical of the whole apparatus of Confucian thought and institutions, but also the legalists, the Mohists who saw a kind of equality of love and care being fundamental rather than the graded love and care that starts with family relations for Confucius. So that we have a range of possibilities within Confucianism, but also a range of possibilities in dialogue with Confucianism, which was characteristic of at least some flowerings of Confucian thought amongst other kinds of thought in China. Well, turning to today, we see that there are certain likenesses between Confucius as a critic of the society he was in. He certainly didn't live in Confucian society. He saw a society that was full of greed, of dishonesty, of violence, of frustration, of prosperity, of any notion of human flourishing. And that it was a world that he was trying to correct in a certain way. So he had a critique of existing society. And again, if we turn to modern political philosophers, some of them have abstracted from the actualities of society and have ideal theories which, at least in principle, are divorced from the circumstances of the society they're in. So maybe if Confucius were here today, he would say, well, let's look at society and see if it's all right or if it needs to be reformed. You could say that he also, in his own time, was trying to reach back to something a long time before where there was documentation. And he was asked, well, are you just restoring the rights? He said, well, we don't know how the rights were institutionalized or lived through in ancient times. We have echoes of that. We have to look at rights now and how to revive them. And maybe we have the same questions now. We have to look at our society and some element of the moral and political character of society in modernity, in periods of modernity, which for Confucius was his own period of modernity, to see how we should live here and now. So again, I'm saying you ask Confucian questions rather than give Confucian answers. Let me just give one example, and that is Confucius in the Analects is meant to say, when the Tao prevails, you should engage in public life, and you should be proud of success, of wealth and reputation by thriving in such a life. When the Tao doesn't prevail, a Confucian should be ashamed of riches and public regard. So one question we have from a Confucian source, which is related in his case to the view as to whether the ruler was a ruler according to a Confucian notion of how to be a ruler or a tyrant. And we can generalize in our circumstance, not just from an individual ruler, but from a whole system of rule, which is bureaucratic and complex in any modern society, even one which does centralize rule in a single leader or president or prime minister or monarch, and ask, in our time, how can we tell when the Tao prevails and when it doesn't prevail in our own society, including Chinese society? And it's shameful for a Confucian who has moral cultivation and sensibility, epistemology and ethics of a Confucian, to thrive, or should the Confucian hide himself and not take part in public life, become much more like the Taoist model of how to thrive. And those answers to the questions of society today, any society, including British society, American society, Russian society, Chinese society, any society in the world, is how a person with a Confucian sensibility should live and how he should regard whether to be shamed of his times or proud of his times. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we just want to thank you, Dr. Bunnin, for this very penetrating thought. And we want to just begin our panel discussion. I have a question. I think I have some questions for Professor Bai. He mentioned the Confucian vision of immigration, but just from the perspective of Western analytical philosophy, some may argue that, so you said that the Confucian view is that the immigration is conditional upon the welfare of the people inside that state. Well, some may argue that we don't know what that welfare is. And sometimes, so we may ask whether if immigration affects your buying power, or if just because of immigration you are not able to buy some luxury goods, is your welfare being hampered? Or so how do you define that welfare? I think it's a very controversial subject. But also from a lack egalitarian point of view, that the welfare, so the Confucian view is that the welfare of the people in that state is more important than the welfare of the immigrants. But from a lack egalitarian point of view, they may say that you are just very lucky to be born, to live in a very flourishing society, and some people are unlucky and they want to just come to a very flourishing society. But what, do you make a distinction between the lucky people and the unlucky people? Well, so I think there may be something going on there, and I really want to see your response.
Right, thank you for the question. So I'm a philosopher. Philosophers are good with big visions, not detailed technical issues. But I think it's really difficult to define well-being, right? And so how much well-being is affected that we should stop, receiving refugees and things like that. I think it's a very difficult issue to address. But I think the general idea, though, is that think about the German policy to refugees, right? Merkel said open the border, and then there was a big backlash against it. I think that's the Confucian worry. Ideally, of course, we want to take all the refugees in, but when it demands too much from the local people reaction, the result is from extreme altruism to extreme selfishness. And so actually during Mensch's time, he's fighting against two schools of thought, the Moe school and the Yangzhou school. The Yangzhou school is sort of the selfish school, and the Moe school is the more altruistic school. And Mensch says there are actually the two sides of the same coin. I think that's his point. I think one good example, think about the Cultural Revolution in China. In the Cultural Revolution, we are educated, brainwashed to transcend ourselves. We want to become Leifeng, the altruistic ideal. And maybe, temporarily we could get there through brainwashing. But after Cultural Revolution in the early 80s, when I got my formal education, that was the time when selfishness was celebrated. So one analogy I like to use is sort of like being completely altruistic is sort of like being high. We human beings cannot be on the kind of high state for very long. We can do drugs to get us high, but when the drug effect is off, we go from one very a happy stage to a depressed stage. So we can be very altruistic for a short period of time, but that cannot be lasting because our human nature, human limit. Then we go from there to extreme selfish response, just like the German and I think the East European responses to refugees today. So the answer to the egalitarian criticism is that what they're proposing sounds beautiful, but it's too good to be true. So sometimes a lot of our life depends on luck, and we cannot correct all the luck we have. We can just do so much. I think that's the human limit Confucians try to acknowledge.
Yes, thank you very much. I think you mentioned the realistic aspect of Confucianism with regard to immigration, but there are also some ideal aspects of Confucianism, especially with regard to self-transformation and the cultivation of virtues. And Dr. Bunnin mentioned that in Confucianism, what really matters is the transformation of the self. I just recall that you also wrote a paper on Mo Zongsan and Kant, and you said that so you discussed Mo Zongsan's critique of Kant's view that there cannot be intellectual intuition among human beings. I just want to say, so in Confucianism today, we not only need to know what moral ideals are, what the virtues are, we need to know why we should hold them dear and why we need to cultivate these virtues. And this seems to be presupposed upon some intellectual intuition. So I just want to know your views about whether there is intellectual intuition and whether the arguments about that, how that affects Confucianism today.
Well, I think my view is that, like all of these key terms, they have histories and they have complexities. Aristotle more or less introduced the notion of intellectual intuition, which was creative and which was not confined to something beyond sensibility, as it was for Kant. Kant said, God, if there is a God, God might have it. Maybe the angels have it if they're angels. But it's beyond human limited capacities. But Aristotle thought that a kind of at least initial intellectual intuition or the achievement of intellectual intuition could be arising from scientific, as science was understood in his time. So that there is a possibility, if there is intellectual intuition, it might be more like Aristotle's than Kant's. But the question is important for Mozart because he said if there isn't intellectual intuition, not just Confucianism, but all of Chinese philosophy is a museum piece. It fails. It might be a grand and wonderful failure, but it's like looking at the ruin of an ancient temple rather than something that is living and dynamic and available for agency and practical employment. And it seems to me it's an open question as to whether we can have intellectual intuition. But also the notion of transformation is related, I think, also to a possible metaphysical view that underlies both Confucianism and Taoism. And that is located, insofar as we have access to it, in a metaphysics of change rather than a metaphysics of substance, or a metaphysics of becoming rather than a metaphysics of being. But it's also a question whether we need metaphysics in order to make sense of Confucian doctrines, or whether that is unnecessary. And again, you'll be frustrated by now when I say there are lots of different views of what metaphysics is. And on some, if it's just an understanding of how we can make sense of things, then that's not something that leads on to its being far away from us. But this is related not so much to Confucian tradition in China, but to Buddhist tradition, where enlightenment in Buddhism can be seen as seeing the world as very different from the world that we live in. But in other strands of Buddhism, it's seeing the world that we live in, not something far away, but in a new light, in a new way. And the re-encounter with actuality is what enlightenment is. And again, maybe with the kind of intuition we're talking about and of metaphysics we're talking about, it's a metaphysics of grasping the ordinary, but with an enriched sensibility. And these are philosophical matters which might not be of immediate importance to everyone in the audience, I understand. Not everyone is a philosopher, not everyone should be a philosopher. It's a kind of fault or disease or deformity that some of us share and some of us don't. But nevertheless, in China, thought isn't immediately transformed into popular view or to institutions or to ways of living. But nevertheless, with the idea of reading classics and responding and reflecting on classics, it's part of Chinese culture that shouldn't be cut out and denied.
Thank you very much. Since self-transformation is such an important concept in Confucianism, I think it also bears upon what Dr. Xu said about climate change. You rely on people's kind of self-cultivation and the cultivation of virtues and their ethical understandings of their family relationships, their understanding of the world, their understanding of heaven, in order to deliver a kind of a good policy or good behavior in response to climate change. But since you specialize in law, I just want to ask whether that cultivation of virtue is in conflict with law, the law of climate change, so to speak. If you rely on law, then it will provoke the sense of fear among people. So people just have to do something about climate change, not because they care about climate change, but because they have to obey the law. So how can you reconcile that rule by virtue and rule by law, which has been the central concern for Confucius as well?
Okay, thank you for your question. I mentioned the importance of self-cultivation. So this is a basis, but we shouldn't ignore other players. For example, the family and the state. So they all play a very important role in maintaining the whole social order. So like self-cultivation, we shouldn't regard it as kind of separate issue, but I think we should think about it together with the governance by the state and the role of the family in kind of managing family affairs. So this self-cultivation, family management, state governance, they all connected, and they all contribute to this continual development process. So this is, I think, we need to take this holistic view and kind of adopt this connected approach. In terms of the rough law or the rule by virtue, I think so. So what kind of law are we talking about? I think maybe you kind of focus on the role of the state law, but bear in mind there's kind of people emphasize the importance of natural law, or if you think about the kind of law that governing climate change is usually emphasize the importance of international law or this soft law. So they for some forms of soft law, they are not binding, but they they have kind of this moral authority. And even if you think about state law, if you think about the aim of it, the purpose is to maintain social order. So I don't think that state law necessarily contrasts the emphasis of morality or virtue. So I don't. So So there are differences, but there are also similarities if you think about the purpose of the law and morality.
Thank you very much. I think it is time to open up the floor to the audience. Are there any questions you want to ask? Just that lady, please. Yes.
First of all, thank you all very much for your great speeches and discussion. So, as a general question to the panel, it seems that Confucius and Emeritus, they were not interested in arguing. They simply voiced out their opinions about things. And nowadays we study that by engaging in their texts and teasing out these arguments, these opinions of them. So, is there anything wrong with this very act of us arguing with or about them?
So I think it's a common understanding that Confucianism were early Chinese thinkers. Unlike the Western philosophers, don't make arguments. They don't write treatises. the analects is a collection of conversations Confucius had with his pupils. But actually, in one of my papers, I said that if you look at the short conversations carefully, oftentimes they are very concise argumentation. I would call it the argumentation sketch. So, in one dialogue, Confucius was asked, should we repay a hateful deed with a virtuous deed, 以怨以德报怨, right? So, and his answer, if you think about it, just 4 Chinese characters. So, if you do that, how can you repay a virtuous deed? So, repay a hateful deed with a virtuous deed, it sounds very forgiving, but his answer suggests that forgiving action is doing injustice to the good people in the world, right? So, so in a way, that's just like a one-line argument, but it shows I think the key problem with that kind of all-forgiving argument, all-forgiving attitude. So in that sense, I said it's an argumentation sketch. And why sketch? I think the sketch shows the important direction to the issue in question. It's sort of like if you ask me how to get to the Oxford train station, right? I can give you walk 5 steps this way, 5 steps that way, and I give you a very detailed direction, but you couldn't understand how to get there. Instead, I say, see that church, go there and turn right, and then something like that. So the argumentation sketch can give at least thoughtful people very clear directions. I think that's the beauty of it. So I think I give just one example. There are many examples. There are even more elaborate arguments in the Analects, and more so in the mention in Xunzi and Hanbeizi and all these texts. I think the arguments are there, and they are arguing with each other. Confucius arguing with his pupils, and also the commentators, the classical commentators on these classical Confucian texts, also in a way argue with the masters. Right? So I think in that, I think argumentation is always there. It's just expressed differently from the mainstream Western philosophical text.
I think that Xunzi is closer to a Western text in that it's an orderly treatise covering topic in a way that sounds much more like what you would find in Aristotle than anything in Confucius or Mencius. But the great 20th century historian of Chinese philosophy, as well as a wonderful philosopher in his own right, Feng Yulan, was accused not of discovering argument, but inventing argument. And again, this is something you can think both ways about the text and listening to see whether there's something that sounds right about a kind of taking a hidden argument that was there and making it available, unconcealing it, to use a Heideggerian phrase, or there's something wrong, that it's an invention rather than a discovery. And again, there's a lot that you can't tell one way or the other. But Confucius also thought that there's a special role, not just for the well-trained moral individual who acted and thought and saw differently from the small people, and that the aim of self-transformation that everyone could achieve, but virtually no one does, is sagehood. And what's the difference between a sage and a person who's just brought up in a moral culture and knows how to act and how to think and how to feel? One way of looking at it, and this goes back to the Book of Changes, where the first element of the Book of Changes is sometimes translated as creative creativity, as being fundamental to all of the rest of the order and the sense of order and change in the metaphysics of change. For Confucius, the sage had the role of being able to invent the rights, invent the virtues, and to alter what has been received. So ideally, we would have a sage now who had a Confucian vision, and for example, could say, well, the virtues that were celebrated in Confucius's own time and throughout much of Chinese history are not appropriate for the modern world. We have to have a sense of being governed by virtue, which is both ethical virtue, but intellectual virtue, and power. Virtue and power are the same notion, capacity. to understand what would be the virtues we would have now. The key virtue, well, the particular one which is central to the system is that of Ren, or benevolence and humanity, and the idea that one's own autobiography, the account of an autobiography in the Analects, what might actually be what Confucius said or might be an invention, was that you move stage by stage and eventually have the unity of doing what's right and the spontaneity rather than contemplation and reflection leading to what's right. But that's when you are fully human. And being human is something which is a process and a development and an ideal to achieve or to attempt to approximate, rather than something that is given to us as something stable for all human beings, as one interpretation of Confucius' thought was. So again, the notion of the plasticity, the pliability, the responsiveness to new circumstances is very, very important as a kind of aspect of Confucian theory, not as frozen, but as dynamic, creative, and reflective, that would be appropriate for at least some of the questions we're asking. In the modern world, can people flourish without liberty? Can people flourish without rights? Now, if you have one view of Confucianism where these are excrescences from other modern theories, a theory of how to live a modern world, then you say, well, maybe there's an alternative within Confucianism. But you can also say there's nothing wrong with someone with Confucian sensibility asking the question whether these ideas from other traditions should be central to Confucianism in the modern world. And again, there are a lot of disputes within modern Confucian philosophical thought and practical thought, not just political philosophy, but also theory and practice, policy studies, where these questions seem to be quite central still.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
Oh, you want to say?
I haven't.
Yeah.
Can I say something?
Wait.
Oh, sorry.
Right. Yeah, thank you for your question. I agree with you. So if we look at Confucius' writing, he's not making arguments. So I think it's like engaging with a conversation with other people. So I think he sees himself as an educator, as a teacher, rather than arguing with each other. But if you think about, so for example, our panel, and when we discussing different sorts of within Confucianism, we are not necessarily making arguments. Rather, we are engaging in a conversation, and we are comparing these different sorts of Confucianism. So we are kind of seeking similarities, and also we embracing differences. So I think conversation is something that is different from just like making arguments with each other.
Yes, thank you very much. Just because of the time limit, I think we are just going to ask our speakers. One speaker is answering one question only, so that will make things go smoothly. Just the gentleman far back, please. Yes.
Sorry, can I?
So could you just still move forward a little bit?
I couldn't hear it very well.
The different positions I mentioned on legal order.
I think that Sun Tzu placed greater emphasis on the rectification of names, and Mencius played greater emphasis on the mandate of heaven. It's not that they're exclusive, but they are different ways of framing and approaching the question of what an appropriate political order would be and how we use Confucian roots to establish our response to any political order. And it might be open in both cases, not saying what political order should be, but what are the cases where something's gone wrong with political order that needs correction, and also possibly the mode of correction. Although it was very interesting in Mencius, was asked whether the assassination of a particular ruler was acceptable or not. And he said the ruler wasn't a ruler, more along the lines of he was a tyrant, so killing him wasn't killing the ruler, but killing a tyrant, which is related to the notion of the rectification of names. Let the ruler be the ruler, let the father be the father, and so on. So, again, I think they weren't rivals, they were complementary, and my view is that in our understanding, we shouldn't, again, think of one defeating the other, but as being conversation and mutual enrichment of ideas in a tradition.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just any questions, please? That gentleman there, please. Yes.
Thank you for your contribution and it's a pleasure to hear you speak today. My question arises from Professor by bringing up the Cultural Revolution. I was just wondering, as a generation, I'm speaking for the younger generation here, but that's less affected by these sort of modern traditions in China that are associating with Confucianism with sort of Fengjian ideals and sort of destruction of Confucianism caused by movements such as the Cultural Revolution. How should we, as the younger generation, who's less affected by these movements than our grandparents, view these?
I don't know. To me, it's more kind of a theoretical question. So sometimes people say, in spite of all the atrocities Mao committed, he saved China from the foreign invaders. But the Confucians have a distinction between the laws of state and the laws of tianxia. By laws of tianxia, it means that the laws of moral order. So the laws of state is terrible, but it's not as bad as laws of moral order were a way of civilized life. So from a Confucian perspective, the Cultural Revolution is the laws of tianxia, the laws of moral order. And at least from a Confucian perspective, whatever Mao did to save China from foreign invaders couldn't justify the things he did in the land reform and Cultural Revolution. And in a way, we're still suffering from that. Nowadays there's the resentment of the rich, right, among the Chinese. And how could that happen? To me, during the land reform in the 50s, you confiscated the land of the landlords who Confucian consider the village worthy, right? They are the lower level educated Confucians, most of them. Now, of course, there are bad ones. They make their fortune by working hard, and they should be rewarded, not punished. But in the 50s, the land reform, their land was taken away, and they were given to others, equally. And now, if you think back, now some people get rich because they happen to possess a piece of land. But it's not really their land. It's the land of the landlord that was taken away. And so they got rich. And my land is just next to his, but my land was not developed, so I'm still poor. And so in that sense, there's a sense of lack of fairness in this, which I think is caused by the most radical communist reform. So in that sense, I think it still affects us today. If we don't think about that kind of historical issue, we cannot understand the political reality of China today. So in that sense, although it's not really relevant, I was not directly affected by the Cultural Revolution. I was born in 1970 toward the end of the Cultural Revolution, but still I think a lot of things we're facing today is a result of what happened under Mao, and a lot of things he did to Chinese traditions, I think is not only bad from Confucian point of view, but just bad in general. So that's why I think in the morning, Professor Renameter said that he has a kind of positive view of the May 4th movement. I think May 4th movement really started the whole anti-traditional movement, which I think leads to more problems than solutions. I think to understand them is very important for us to move on.
Well, I think we only have time for last question. Just the lady far back, please. Oh, sorry. Could you just move forward because we cannot hear you?
As Prof just mentioned about the Confucianism is about all different people. It's about like between family members and friends. Most of the Chinese, like in ordinary compulsory education, like we were introduced to Confucianism like through textbooks, through subject curriculum. But in that way, we interpret the Confucianism as a way more like a justification for imperial ruling. So that kind of feeling makes it feel very remote from that specific ideology rather than adapted into our life. So my question is that whether Confucianism will become a way of ordinary people to, like, in a way of living rather than something that we learn from textbooks, and also what can we do to, like, people to achieve that future that we have, whatever we do.
So you think from like your learning of Confucianism is more like it's kind of justification of the imperial ruling. So I think that's really kind of partial understanding of the Confucian ethos in my talk, because I think that is only part of it and not the most important part of it, because as I said, I think we have to think about the whole process and the different actors. So you start from the self, so self-cultivation, and then you think about the importance of family, so its role in managing family affairs, and then it came to the importance of the state, so the governance of the state, and then you also need to think the higher level, which is about heaven, about like peace and social order. So I think it's kind of, you have to think about the different actors. So my suggestion is to kind of read the classics, not only parts of it or kind of the reconstruction of it in a modern way. I think we kind of need to go back to the classics and kind of think about, see it as kind of continual process, and everything is connected, rather than just kind of thinking about, well, it's only kind of justification of the imperial role, because that's maybe only part of it, and it's not like kind of important part of it. Yeah, that's it.
My question is actually about the way that the Confucianism is educated in Southern. It kind of skipped actually go back to the classics. We kind of skipped the understanding of the role of like family and stuff. It's more like I'm actually asking on a more general
Right.
rather than what I understand, because I absolutely understand that we should always look into this original material rather than just interpreting like these.
Okay.
Well, I think time is running out. We have to end up here. Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your attention and participation. Yes. Thank you.